everyone. This is update for December 11, 2023, day 656 of the war and of the date update. Actually, also catch up for December 10 and December 9. I'm gonna start as always with general strategic updates, and I'm gonna switch then to the situation on the battlefield. So first, I want to open up with how Russia is viewing sort of Ukraine, this conflict of war in Ukraine. It is a very, let's say, delusional narrative that's being pushed in the West, and I would say in particular in the US, where there's some kind of view that Russia just simply wants to keep this Crimea and these territories that were captured so far from Ukraine, which is completely wrong. Russia's view is it wants all of the Ukraine, and it actually wants not all of the Ukraine. Most likely, then sort of next on the list are Baltic states, because effectively at this point, Estonia and Finland essentially cutting off free access to the Baltic Sea to Russia, which is essentially what Peter the Great was doing. He started the Northern War to get access to the Baltic Sea, and so at this point there is problem there. So Russia is, if you sort of put yourself in Russia's shoes, it's experiencing sort of problems or being cut off from the major sort of oceans, from the main trade routes, essentially in the Baltic Sea. And in Ukraine is obviously also works as a very important buffer, and it's more sort of for ideological reason is extremely important piece for Russia. For that reason, the Russian president, I think, he had like a reception for them for the veterans of the Russian-Ukrainian war, and he clearly stated Ukraine has no future, Ukraine has no ideology, Ukraine has no industry, and so on. Basically, the view is Ukraine that Russia is planning to capture all of the Ukraine, and I would add even more from Russian perspective. It's it's a war with West, and more specifically with the U.S. It's not, from Russian perspective, it's not war with Ukraine. So it's extremely delusional to present this some kind of Russia is fighting for this, small pieces of territory, and so this is absolutely misguided view. Furthermore, Russia actually managed to develop ideology. There was a perennial problem in Russia since the fall of the Soviet Union. There was no real ideology. It was hard to convince people what to die for, and in some ways that actually what kept, for the most part, Russia at bay. There was no, even if Russian political top wanted to do something, they didn't have ideology to motivate people to go into the war. Now, effectively, what's going on in the West created ideology for Russia, or gave ideas that can be used to create ideology and to explain what we're fighting for, and sort of have, let's say, moral and higher order ideals for the ordinary Russian, and explain, why they need to die for, and people willing to die for those ideals. So this, in some ways, what the sort of cultural developments over past, let's say, 15 years plus in the West, essentially gave power to Russian political top, which is completely devoid of any ideology. The only ideology in the Russian political top is to remain in power. They really don't care about this sort of family values that they declare and so on. This is not what they really believe. However, it's a convenient tool, convenient ideology to motivate people inside of the country. And mm, so this actually gave, essentially, it enabled this war and general expansion of Russia, and it actually ensures that this expansion will continue, because now there's ideological foundation, which is the strongest foundation you can have. And on the other side, West lost its old ideological foundation. So essentially, in some way, it flipped the places with Russia, where Russia, after the fall of the Soviet Union, communism was completely discredited, and there was no ideology. It was simply vacuum, and so it was sort of like a ship in the ocean without compass, right? So just moving wherever the wind blows. Then, as I said, over, let's say, especially past like 5-7 years, Russian political top developed this ideology, which is, basically opposite of what's being essentially pushed in the West these days. And the West has lost its own ideology in many ways and become sort of its old ideals in ideology. And so now it's, in a way, fighting from sort of lower ground in some ways. So that's the most important sort of understanding why this is not a war about Ukraine. This is not a war about, Lugansk, Donbass, or Crimea, or Zaporizhya, or Kherson region. Those are just small pieces of the puzzle. Nobody even really truly thinks about it in Russian political top. This is just a temporary situation. This is how it's viewed right now in Russia, on the path to basically recapturing all of the Ukraine, and most likely Baltic states, and effectively the long-term goal of Russia is to turn Finland into neutral state. How it's going to be done remains to be seen. And then there's another sort of item on the list is dealing with Poland, but that's going to be sort of on the dessert for Russia. So again, this sort of discourse in especially in the U.S., where somehow Russia is being presented as the savior of old values, and just really wanted to have its own sphere of influence is as I said, completely misguided and delusional. So hopefully that sort of explains the sort of situation. The tragedy is that Ukraine has extremely incompetent, and for that reason extremely corrupt political top and military top. That's completely, I would say, unfit for the moment crucial moment that Ukraine is facing, and that's a tragedy of Ukraine. In some ways, it's a tragedy of the West that this is what's really happening. Now let's switch to other topics, a little bit more sort of practical, and I'm going to talk about a little bit about the economy. So that chicken egg crisis in Russia is growing and turning into actually really sort of national problem. The prices went as high as, I think, like $1.5 for 10 eggs. That's a sort of normal batch size in Russia. And there are some shortages. There is sort of panic among consumers that's trying to buy, and all of the sort of things that come with it. The actual reason for this situation is actually very interesting, and actually explains how primitive management is inside of Russia. So if you remember, I mentioned probably like in July and August that there was shortages of chicken meat in Russia. So what turns out, what so basically then there is, I would say, directive from the Russian political top, basically from Russian president. Okay, fix the problem. So all of these bureaucrats, the way they fixed the problem, they started basically killing these chickens that lay eggs and sell them as sort of meat chicken. And so as a result, you have sort of you alleviated problem with the chicken meat temporarily, but then you created down the sort of downstream the problem with chicken eggs because you don't have enough um, uh, egg laying chicken now, and so the problem was alleviated sometime in August, and now Russia hit the problem at this moment. So they're trying to solve it with help of Turkey. Remains to be seen. At this point, the crisis is becoming more acute. So far, there is no sort of relief from sort of Turkish import, but more likely than not, they probably gonna resolve that problem. Then few more words about Russian industry. Russian aluminum smelting industry is in crisis mode. They barely uh, profitable. Essentially, they probably not terrible. They basically uh, between the profit and loss and any sort of unfavorable movements in the global market will probably tip over Russian aluminum smelting industry into loss-making enterprise as a whole, which is going to be very important and critical for Russian military industry because aluminum is the crucial metal in manufacturing of pretty much anything in the military, especially engines, the aircraft, helicopters, everything that's sort of like call it like fine mechanics. It's all using some aluminium alloys, and even all of, in some of these IFVs that Russia is using. That's like also are using a lot of aluminium. They horrible basically for that actually reason. Basically, kamikaze IFVs, and Ukraine is using them as well. But they cheap and better than nothing. And so, however, this again, this potentially can create huge problems for Russia. And the reason, one of actually reasons why there is a problem, is because Ukraine and specifically Mykolaiv, there was um, alumina refining facility, alumina processing. Basically, the point of that facility was um, that the raw material that was imported from Africa was refined to increase aluminum content, or actually aluminum oxide. Uh, Oxidized aluminum. I'm not sure how to say it in English, but basically increase that and then use it, and then use this um, um, material to actually in the smelting process of aluminum. So that facility in Mykolaiv is now fully controlled by Ukraine, and Russia has no access to it. So this really creates problems because Russia doesn't have its own raw material, and otherwise importing it is from other places, basically not through Mykolaiv. Is really well, it's a long-term solution because they need to build refining facility, and basically there's no short-term solution to this situation. Another situation now, a little bit about how consumers are feeling in Russia, because Russia is actively attempting to replace Western personal cars, specifically German cars, and to some extent French cars and Italian cars, with Chinese cars. And so there was survey of Russian drivers that were extremely unfavorable of quality of Chinese cars. So this is they're totally not comparable. Basically, consumers really don't like them for the quality reasons. To the point that Chinese manufacturing are planning to reduce prices 10 to 15% in Russia starting 2024. And it just shows you how to say uncomparable they are to Western cars. At the same time, Western cars are costing essentially 2 times more than, let's say, in Germany. So, for example, BMW 5 Series costs in Russia exactly 2 times more than what it costs the same car in Germany. So, as you can see, there is a huge sort of premium to the West, let's say, German cars, because they are probably the most popular in Russia. Uh, and still people not willing to buy Chinese car, which are already significantly cheaper, and Chinese manufacturer has to reduce prices. So you can see there is a huge delta between the price of a German car and Chinese car, which reflects the sort of value or perception of the value of these cars by average Russian driver. I'm gonna switch a little bit now to situation in Ukraine and more political situation in Ukraine. The as I mentioned, Ukrainian parliament at this point legitimacy is sort of questionable because their term expired, I think, in October of this year, and they just extended their own sort of term, which is, in my view, completely illegal because they're supposed to be re-elected. But there is a more problem in Ukrainian parliament. All of these people who are sort of random there, who are just, to call it, make deals and do corruption and push their own interests, now they living in droves. So the number of the so basically they're resigning, and the number of the members of the parliament went down to 400. So the original number is 450, and so you can see, and I think because Russia actually captured some of the territories like Crimea originally, so the number was 437, and then it's already 400, and there is quite a bit more people or members of the parliament who want to quit. So essentially, you can kind of like judge from that sort of I would call it like rats jumping the ship, because they see it from inside, and then they see there's no opportunity. There's very sort of little opportunities to loot, and there's a lot of there's quite a bit of risk for what could happen to them eventually, and so they essentially living in droves Ukrainian parliament. Again, Ukrainian president supposed to be re-elected in March. He stated that there won't be any re-election, so essentially no election of Ukrainian parliament, no election of Ukrainian president. As I said before, eventually, probably by that time, March, April, May, when things will get, I would say, much worse for Ukraine, there will be a lot of problem with his legitimacy, and basically that by itself creating very combustive political situation in Ukraine on its own, without even considering the whole, military problem in Ukraine. Now I'm gonna do walk through the front line in a clockwise fashion, as I always do, starting from very north. And then moving down south. So situation along the state border remains quiet and sort of normal. Nothing important has happening there. Now let's move to the North Luhansk front line. Things here are also somewhat quiet. It's quieter than it used to be. There's some Russian pressure towards from northeast of Kupiansk, but again, it's all purely tactical pressure at this point. Now let's move to North Donbass front line. There's some fairly weak Russian pressure in this area, whereas actually they used to put pressure during Wagner times, but again, it's all tactical here, nothing major. The more sort of major pressure by Russian forces is basically west of Bahmut and straight south of Bahmut, where they lost some ground. Now they are, they gained some ground actually. This village Hromove, mentioned it before, and they keep putting pressure with attempt to recapture Klishchiivka and Andriivka, which are critical points towards moving towards this freshwater channel. So that's sort of next goal for the Russian troops here. Now let's move to central Donbass front line. There is extremely heavy Russian pressure around Avdiivka, all over it. I would probably say one of the heaviest couple days where Russian forces really trying to sort of basically force withdrawal of Ukrainian troops. So, and I would say that situation is extremely difficult for Ukrainian forces. The only way to relieve it is through some counterattack, and as I said before, because the Ukrainian army is not capable of doing it for many reasons. It's like there's not even a reason why it would be able to do it. So for that reason, they cannot relieve the situation, and so the pressure will continue, and eventually, probably Ukrainian forces will succumb to that pressure, and Ukraine will lose Avdiivka. Again, this also hinges on the Russian side continuing the same pressure, right? So, don't have reports from Russian General Staff headquarters, so cannot sort of estimate. But I would say that based on the numbers of sort of this new recruits in Russian army, they probably have enough to capture Avdiivka. What's going to happen next is another question, but there is probably enough to accomplish this fairly limited, I would say, tactical goal. But as I said before, this is not going to be about tactical. It's going to be presented as ideological victory, political victory, and it's going to be pushed in the West and in the US particularly as a reason why not to give help to Ukraine, not to support financially and military-wise Ukraine, and that's essentially the goal of this. So that's why there's so much pressure being put right now, because in some ways it's there is negotiations going on in terms of providing help to Ukraine, and capturing Avdiivka will put a wrench in those negotiations essentially. And if that happens, it will be extremely beneficial for the Russian side. In terms of negotiations themselves, based on my understanding, Democratic Party is willing to compromise. I would say it's in some ways it's a desperation compromise, because it's really undermining position of Democratic Party in the U.S. politically. So they are effectively between a rock and a hard place. But I think there is understanding that this is much more crucial than probably what this means is losing upcoming elections. Now let's move to Marinka. Situation in Marinka is somewhat the same. Ukrainian forces are holding on to sort of half of the street in the western outskirts of Marinka. Essentially, as I said before, Ukraine lost Marinka. It's technically or de jure, I can still say that Ukraine is still holding on to some couple, half a street or whatever, third of the street in Marinka and Western outskirts, and so can say that it's not lost, but from all intents and purposes, it's lost at this point. Now let's move to the Zaporizhya front line. Things here are somewhat sort of typical for the rest of the front line, where Russian troops are attempting local tactical attacks to recapture lost ground, essentially. That's what's really happening. And as you can see, the area here is actually pretty cleverly selected where they're attacking. Similar here. However, they did not advance so far anywhere there. Now the final section of the front line is along the Dnipro River. Things here are somewhat quiet. Russian forces are not attempting to destroy the bridgehead near Krinky. In terms of using let's say infantry and so on, it's mostly artillery fire, bombs, and so on. So basically, they try to limit sort of waste of resources, simply because Ukraine has effective artillery support from the other side of the river, and it's really basically you can kind of like have like a shell curtain, and going through it is a big problem for it really leads to huge losses. Russian troops tried it a couple times, totally unsuccessful, and there is a realization there is no point of doing anything there. Russian forces report that Ukraine has a lot of this FPV drones there, which is they are basically kamikaze attack drones, and that's another sort of deterrent for the Russian troops. So basically, this whole situation turns into complete status quo. Ukrainian command is not attempting to expand to basically breach out of this bridgehead for reasons unknown to me, I guess. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Until next time. Bye bye.